And just a reminder for those who have just came in that we're planning to have the chat window open up at about 11:25. People will be able to ask questions then, which I'll say aloud to Deen. And that we're planning for, unless there are important clarifying questions, we're planning for the questions to be asked at the end of the talk. So with that, let's introduce the speaker. Deen Freelon is an associate professor at the Hussman School of Journalism and Media at UNC Chapel Hill. He was previously an assistant professor at AMU and received a PhD in communication from the University of Washington and an MA in communication from the same place, and a BA in psychology with honors from Stanford University. He's written in many places, including Science and PNAS, specializing in misinformation as well as discussions of computational social science. And with that, I would love for you to take it away, Deen.
Let me go ahead and unmute myself. Thank you very much for that introduction, Keith. Today I'm going to talk about, or the talk that I'm going to give is sort of an offshoot of a paper that some colleagues and I wrote in Science magazine, that came out last September. And the paper kind of puts a lot of what I'm going to talk about today in more sort of formal terms, but I wanted to use it as a jumping off point to explore one of the major points in the paper, which has to do with ideological asymmetries in the prevalence of disinformation and other types of online activism. So with that, I'll just go ahead and get started. I always like to include this slide for folks. I've given this talk several different times. This is actually one of the more extended versions of this talk that I've given, and I don't like to make too many assumptions about what people do and don't know about digital media, digital and social media activism. So this is an active research area for over 2 decades. There have been countless studies published on this. Both popular and scholarly interest in this topic remains quite strong. And also, just to speak specifically to the role of computational social science, it's actually been quite strong and integral in the study of this general topic. And much of what I'll discuss is computationally amenable, as we'll see. So the piece that we wrote in Science, I wrote this piece with my colleagues Alice Marwick and Daniel Kreese. It came out last September, as I mentioned. And we were commissioned to write a piece that looked at differences between the left and the right insofar as they use the internet for social activism and political activist purposes. And so our main goal was to sort of use the literature, the interdisciplinary literature on this as a lens through which we observe what really is going on here. And most of this talk will discuss our findings as well as some reflections that have emerged and occurred to me since the piece was published, gosh, almost 6 months ago now. All right. So the first part of the piece talks about Clicktivism and Slacktivism. And we included this piece because at the time, there was a lot of conversation about, in the popular press, about the extent to which social media activism, that is activism that occurs within the social media sphere, is real activism, and to what extent does it really just sort of give you the substitute or the feeling of activism without actually being the real thing? And so we found that the literature on this question presents almost no evidence that online engagement substitutes for quote unquote real offline engagement. Rather, in almost all cases, online engagement seems to support offline engagement. So people either tend to do both or they tend to do neither. So if they're interested in a given topic, they tend to pursue it both online and offline. Politics is no different. And if they're not interested in it, they tend to pursue it neither online or offline. And there is some evidence, although I feel like this would be a really interesting topic for future research, there is some evidence that Clicktivism or Slacktivism, as it's known, may serve as a gateway for offline engagement, but that is certainly an area for future research. We don't know quite enough about that yet. However, we did find that most relevant research looks at political engagement in somewhat of an undifferentiated way. So the questions, a lot of this research is survey-based, and so a lot of the questions will be about things like voting, signing petitions, campaign volunteering, but they don't tend to differentiate it in terms of specific issues that people are interested in. So they don't tend to explore how people's level of commitment to different issues might affect their willingness to engage in high versus low effort activism. And this is very much in keeping with what we know about how people engage with issues. This may go without saying, but people tend to engage with issues, a very small number of issues that they feel are important to them. And so it may very well be the case that they engage really heavily on those issues that are very close to their heart. And they may use Clicktivism/Slacktivism as a way of engaging with issues that are more tangential to their interests. Now, that is entirely a hypothesis. Hasn't a whole lot of research on that. But we did mention that is one potentially fruitful area of research here. And then finally, this gets to the core question that lies at the core of our piece here. So this question of, does Clicktivism work differently for the left versus the right? So one question is whether it would be a more effective gateway for one or the other. We don't really know the answer to this, and so the general question of ideological asymmetry, as it relates to Clicktivism and Slacktivism, is as yet unresolved and hasn't really been thoroughly addressed by research yet, but it should be. So hopefully, research going forward will take a closer look at that. I mentioned the term ideological asymmetry several times. In comparison to some social science theories and concepts, this one is the term that is used for this one is actually pretty felicitous as these things go. It refers to systematic differences in left-right beliefs and behaviors. And so there's a fair amount of research on this. And so some examples of domains in which ideological asymmetries manifest are the relatively lower levels of trust in the mainstream news that conservatives have relative to liberals and centrists. Conservatives having a stronger preference for ideological echo chambers, which has been demonstrated in multiple studies. Conservatives sharing more false news, and conservatives tolerating politicians spreading disinformation more than other ideological groups. And so these are all examples of well-documented ideological asymmetries that have been observed in recent years. And so this brings us to the eponymous dichotomy of our presentation today. This is #heroes versus disinformation dystopia. And so the images I've selected for this slide, I think are good visual representations of this dichotomy. If we start on the left, right, we see this large pound sign within which you can view many hashtags that have been linked to #activist campaigns over the past few years. And if you look closely at the hashtags that are present on this image, all of them, without exception, are left-leaning, from She Persisted to Me Too, Bernie Sanders, no DAPL, Dakota Access Pipeline, Black Lives Matter, etc. And so the point that's really being driven home by this is that #activism is sort of viewed as a sort of virtuous pursuit that is the exclusive or overwhelming province of the left. This is as true in the scholarly literature as it is in the popular press. On the right, we see a visual representation of disinformation dystopia with a bunch of right-leaning individuals and logos here, from Fox News to InfoWars to Sean Hannity and the rest. And so this is meant to symbolize the overwhelming presence in both the scholarly literature and the popular press of narratives that paint disinformation as the overwhelming or exclusive province of the ideological right. And so this dichotomy in many ways defines the way that we look at the right and the left in terms of how they use digital media for social activism and political activism in 2021. But the question I'm raising in this talk is whether this particular dichotomy, whether this perspective on these respective phenomena is accurate, and how accurate is it? Okay. So one question to ask is, are there holes in the literature, right? So if you look at the upper left quadrant of my little grid here, you see there is a lot of research on hashtag activism on the left, including some that I myself have worked on. And if you look at the bottom right down here, we see there's lots of research on alternative media ecosystems, mis and disinformation on the right. Many more that I can include there, but this is just a small sampling. But if you look at the remaining cells on this grid, there's not a whole lot of research on right-leaning hashtag activism or left-leaning alternative media mis and disinformation. Now, I created this grid a little bit after this paper came out. And so if there has been really interesting and important research that has come out of these areas in the last few months, they would not be represented here. I would greatly appreciate being told about them if you know about these. But I doubt that even within that short period of time, that there would be enough to compensate for the well-established research programs on respectively hashtag activism on the left and alternative media mis and disinformation on the right. And so there's clearly an imbalance here. There's not nothing on these off diagonals, but there's clearly an imbalance. So this presents two possibilities. And of course, this is not a discrete pair, but rather a spectrum. And on the one hand, there is the possibility that the literature as it stands reflects true ideological divisions in online activism operating strategies, right? So everything is as we see it. The literature is reflective of what's actually out there, all is well with the world. And then the second possibility, however, is that there is insufficient research on right-wing hashtag activism and left-leaning disinformation, and that this state of affairs is generating an incomplete empirical portrayal, or somewhere in between. And so this is the question, the core question that I really want to explore, not only in this talk, but also in my own future research. I'm working on research projects that will address this directly. So before I proceed, I do want to talk about the distinct danger of right-wing disinformation, because the questions that we've been talking about so far have generally focused on the prevalence of disinformation itself on different points along the ideological spectrum. But the consequences of disinformation and where they lead is a different question. And I do want to say that I think the events of January 6th have established beyond any doubt that the effects of right-wing disinformation are quite distinct from whatever may be happening on the left. And we haven't seen anything that's remotely comparable to this in terms of the deaths or the implications for democracy. And so I do want to say that lest anyone accuse me or anybody else who pursues this line of inquiry of false equivalency, that this is something where the consequences are quite different. Even if it turned out that the prevalence in terms of, say, number of stories or number of likes, whatever trace data you want to analyze through social media, even if those were to turn out to be pretty close in terms of their prevalence on either side, the consequences can be quite different, as we've seen. So let's review some evidence. So the following two propositions enjoyed strong methodologically diverse empirical support. Firstly, hashtag activism is in fact a widely used and effective mode of online activism for the left. There have been tons of studies on this. It's very, very well established. We know this is true. Second, the right has its own alternative media ecosystem, which is firstly, disproportionately tolerant of mis and disinformation, and secondly, closely networked with ideological leaders, including Trump. So we know that there is something interesting structurally, distinctive structurally, that's going on the right, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other distribution, misinformation distribution systems that exist on the left that may look very different from those on the right. It also doesn't mean that the right doesn't engage in behaviors that we might consider to be similar to what we've seen on the left in terms of hashtag activism. So we need more research to figure this out. So here is, again, some of the evidence that we've seen that there is some left-leaning activism. We now group these research papers actually demonstrate that there is an ideological asymmetry in terms of the consumption and distribution of mis and disinformation and so-called fake news, even though I don't love that term, between the left and the right. So you can see the findings over there on the rightmost column, and they all point in the same direction. However, these three studies, which were pretty prominently placed in places like Science and Science Advances, I think, these are from the 2016 election. So data here were collected prior to Trump being inaugurated. And so we need more additional data on this from the Trump administration and beyond to see what, if anything, has changed. But I haven't seen that yet. It may be out there, but I haven't seen it yet. So I just want to take a couple of illustrative cases that really highlight some conceptual moves that make this kind of research a little bit more difficult than I think it has to be. So the first book, this is #Activism. It's an award-winning book, a really fantastic text that really marries some great computational research methods to some critical theory and some innovative ways. And I really have a lot of great things to say about it. I will criticize it somewhat now because it makes an interesting conceptual move that I think is a little bit problematic. So the highlighted piece of this says, throughout this text, we use #Activism to refer to the strategic ways counter-public groups and their allies on Twitter employ this shortcut to make political contentions about identity politics and advocate for social change, identity redefinition, and political inclusion. So what this definition does, in my estimation, seems to marry the idea of #Activism directly to the policy and social priorities of the ideological left, and specifically the identity conscious ideological left. And so, but I actually don't think that that's the best conceptual move to make, because we're talking about, on the one hand, a set of ideological commitments, and on the other hand, a mode of implementing those commitments. So if you can describe, for example, the formal properties of #Activism, it should at least in theory be possible to use those techniques to pursue different policy and social ends. But this kind of definition, I think, conflates those and makes such an analysis, especially for the ideological right, a little bit more difficult. Here's another case. This comes from Network Propaganda, which is a book that came out in 2018. If you know about research in this area, it's one of the biggest books in it. And it says, the highlighted quote says, in part, a population with high trust and bias disconfirming news and high distrust and bias disconfirming professional norms-driven media will be more vulnerable to disinformation campaigns than a population that generally has higher trust in professional journalism on average, but lower trust in any given media outlet. So again, we're seeing somewhat the deck being stacked a little bit in favor of folks on the right sort of being overwhelmingly credulous when it comes to mis and disinformation, and folks on the left having some degree of protection from that because of their increased trust in mainstream news. And I think that this needs to be interrogated a little bit, and I'll talk about some of the reasons we might question that in a little bit. Right now, in fact. Okay. So network propaganda spends the vast majority of its time discussing right-leaning propaganda. They do devote a little bit of time to talking about one instance of left-leaning propaganda, specifically a case of an allegation against Trump that he was involved in child rape over the summer. Well, not over the summer. So the allegation was made during the summer of 2016, but it was an allegation that Trump was involved somehow in child rape, sort of an inverse QAnon there. And so the basic argument here is that such claims are less relevant. This was a claim that got very, very little traction in mainstream media. So the basic argument here is that such claims are less relevant because they are largely ignored by mainstream news outlets, which is not the case for right-wing media. But one of the things that occurred to me reading this is that when we live in the 21st century, right, it's 2021, there are lots of different ways of distributing mis and disinformation that have nothing to do with the mainstream news. And so while it is significant to point out that mainstream media, the media outlets that are most paid attention to by folks on the left don't distribute this content, it does not therefore follow that there is no disinformation on the left, because we can think of many other distribution channels through which disinformation might circulate, right? It's a possibility, as yet empirically unproven, but we do need to take that seriously. So here's another example that I procured myself. We mentioned this briefly in the science paper. On May 31st, 2020, the Anonymous Hacktivist Collective released a cache of documents purporting to prove that Trump was involved in child sex trafficking. The exact same allegations that were made over the summer of 2016. This was almost entirely ignored by mainstream media sites, but the story picked up 1.1 million retweets within 3 to 4 days. That in of itself, I think, invites further analysis. We don't know who exactly is sharing this content. We know very little about this. We don't know how it fits in with the rest of the media diets of the folks that are engaging with this content, and the similarities and differences in terms of right-wing disinformation sharing, right? So the mere existence of this really does invite future research. I have some preliminary data on this. I collected this data myself. This is the top 20 most retweeted users mentioning Anonymous and Trump from May 31st to June 3rd, 2020. You can see You Are Non-Central, which is Anonymous's main Twitter account, which is at the rightmost over here. I did spot check and make sure that 19 out of 20 of these most retweeted users actually were referring to the anonymous disclosures about Trump. One of them was not, the other 19 were. And just taking a qualitative look at these Twitter accounts, I noticed that very few, first of all, very few of them are politically oriented in general. So most of them spend a lot of their time talking about anime and K-pop and things of that nature, non-political things of that nature. And also, they aren't very prominent in general, right? So these aren't accounts with, you know, hundreds of thousands or even thousands of followers. Most of them had, you know, maybe the low thousands or even below 1,000 followers. And so this kind of distribution network is incredibly interesting to me in terms of trying to figure out how might left-leaning disinformation circulate, among who, and who might be most likely to be convinced by it. So here's some more evidence that I gathered. This comes from September 2016, so it's a little old, but I thought it was quite telling because it did emerge during the same period that those other studies I pointed out a couple of slides ago demonstrated that there was more right-wing disinformation than left-wing. This study not really a formal study, but this analysis by Buzzfeed, it's not peer-reviewed, but what it did look at was three sort of left-leaning, pretty hard left-leaning Facebook pages, and three pretty hard-leaning right-leaning Facebook pages, and analyzed the content that they put on these Facebook pages. And as you can see, the left-leaning pages have a fair amount of mostly false and mix of true and false content, especially relative to the right-leaning pages. And note also that the y-axes here are different. The top line, the top value for the right-leaning y-axis is only 5,000. Top leaning value for the left-leaning axis is 20,000. So again, this is a small, limited number of pages. It's from a very specific time, September 2016. But again, suggestive. I think that this means that we should really go out and check this out, try to figure out whether this is something that persists into 2021. So gives us some warrant for future research once again. I recently also read this piece in the Columbia Journalism Review on Seth Abramson. And so this, I think, gives further evidence of some of the ways in which left-leaning disinformation, or something that may look a lot like it, might look a little bit different from what you find on the right. So for those of you who don't know, Seth Abramson is a guy on Twitter who posts these very, very long Twitter threads about anti-Trump content, primarily, things that may or may not be true. I'm not sure whether he may or may not fit everyone's technical definition of disinformation, but a lot of what he has distributed has actually turned out to be false. And so I think that at best you can say that he's really playing fast and loose with the truth here, because, you know, at least from my perspective, when people post false content that points in the same ideological direction repeatedly, that becomes very suspect and very close to the most formal definitions of disinformation of which I am aware. So this is another example of some of the ways in which left-leaning disinformation may not resemble what we see right. So again, just to summarize, there's no doubt that there's at least some left-leaning disinformation out there. We don't know nearly as much as we do about right-leaning disinformation. The scattered but suggestive evidence here invites more rigorous work going forward. And most importantly, even null results are valuable. So even if we actually go through, we leave no stone unturned, go around looking, and we find out, well, there actually isn't very much left-leaning disinformation after all. I think that's a very important finding. I would absolutely accept that. But it seems clear to me, at least so far, that we have not done enough research to be able to say that conclusively. And I think we should. I wanted to present this because this is an idea that I have that might help us figure this out, right? So a couple of years ago, I wrote a piece for the Knight Foundation that defined what I called filter maps. And so this is based on the idea of an echo chamber, right? So the idea of the echo chamber essentially implicates ideology as the primary boundary line across which we should pay attention to news and public affairs relevant content. So in other words, if you're on the left, you need a wide variety of content that you should engage with. If you're on the right, same thing. But this filter map introduces a new vertical, not new, but a different rather vertical dimension that could be thought of as, basically claim quality, right? So high quality of claims, low quality of claims. That is represented in the vertical dimension here. So if you think about this chart as being for a single individual, the specific Twitter personalities that occur in their feed, and this is just a small smattering, and this is just for demonstrative purposes. So I can see, if this was my feed, for example, I can see up here in the upper left-hand quadrant, these would be people who are mostly truthful and left-leaning. Moving over to the right, right-leaning and mostly truthful. Bottom right, right-leaning, mostly not truthful, low claim quality. On the left, left-leaning, low claim quality. So when you're thinking about the kinds of content that you want people to be exposed to, it should be above that y-intercept, where you're going to be in the mostly true half of the graph, and across the spectrum. So you're not just talking about engaging across ideological lines without reference to how truthful it is. You can make sure and have some idea of where this content is actually going to live. And so we're currently in the stages of developing software that will allow people to generate these maps, personalized maps like these for themselves, for their own use, but also we'll be capturing that data to be able to study it and trying to figure out exactly how much, if we're looking for left-leaning disinformation, we'll be able to look down here and try to figure out how much of this is actually infiltrating people's social media feeds. And then folks will be able to use this also as a means of ideally trying to avoid this, although I did have the terrible thought of people inverting this, right? So if you believe in, Breitbart, Tucker Carlson, and some of these gateway pundits, some of these low information, or even Joy Reid, some of these low information, sources, you can actually flip it along the horizontal x-axis and say, okay, well, here are the really trustworthy ones, and the less trustworthy ones are the mainstream media, right? So that's just simply a reference to the fact that people who are deeply enmeshed in conspiracy theories and disinformation are going to kind of see everything in an upside down way relative to the way that we do. So that pitfall notwithstanding, I do think this could be helpful, especially for people who are already bought into the idea that avoiding disinformation is bad, and increasing the kind of content that they get from the other side, but yet that is truthful, is a worthwhile pursuit. So I also want to talk about this just to fill out our quadrant here, our 4 quadrants here, is hashtag activism on the right. So if, as I mentioned before, hashtag activism is a set of tactics that should theoretically be applicable by individuals outside the left. There's little research on how often this is attempted by the right, let alone how often they succeed at it. There is some anecdotal evidence, however, that suggests that something resembling hashtag activism does exist on the right. So some of you may be familiar with some of these hashtags. You may catch a theme if you look very closely, right? These are boycott campaigns of various corporations that circulated during the Trump administration because they did something that offended conservatives, right? So you got to boycott Netflix, boycott Nike. Some of these did trend on Twitter. I don't know that there's that much rigorous research in terms of how much follow through there was there or how successful these were, but certainly people talked about them. And at least formally, there seem to be many of the same elements as the hashtag activism that we see on the left. So there's a hashtag, obviously, it's asking you to do something, it's political in nature. And so I think that those characteristics alone invite the comparison to some of the other hashtag activism movements that we've seen on the left, and to try to figure out what are the similarities and what are the differences there. Again, right, it's already said it, right? They seem to mimic many aspects of the left-wing hashtag activism playlist. Rigorous research should focus on questions such as the major similarities and differences between the left and the right. Who's behind the hashtags? Who starts them? Are they elites? Are they ordinary citizens? Are they sort of people who have been habitually involved in activism? What are the effects? Are they able to actually produce the results that they're aiming to? Do they just sort of appear and fizzle out? How frequently do they achieve the desired result? What is the news media / political elite response, et cetera, right? These are questions that we asked across that ideological divide. So there is some existing research on this, very little as far as I've been able to see. There's one study that analyzed the Donald, the Reddit subreddit that engaged with that sort of a political trolling community rather, that engaged in hashtag activism activities, including boycott Netflix and draft our daughters. There was another study that came out in a public relations journal that examined boycott Starbucks and boycott Budweiser. This is from a corporate social responsibility, corporate social activism, i.e. not a political perspective. And so I do think, and I would certainly recommend, that such activities be conceptualized either within or distinct from the existing hashtag activism umbrella. So at least it's an interesting comparison point. And if people are going to try to argue that this is not hashtag activism, they should conceptualize it in terms of what it is and contrast it from hashtag activism as it has been conceptualized thus far. So where do we go? What now? What do we do now? So to recap, there is ample evidence that left-wing disinformation and right-wing hashtag activism are understudied at best. We must rectify this to gain a more complete picture of the ideological asymmetries characterized online activism. So this is not false balance. If it does turn out that disinformation is a predominantly right-wing phenomenon, if hashtag activism is in fact predominantly left-wing phenomenon, so be it, but we have to do the work to find out. And I don't know about you, but personally, I think it puts me in somewhat of an odd position to argue that my own personal political beliefs also correlate with aspects of the information environment that are widely considered to be normatively problematic. In other words, as a left-leaning person, I feel a little bit uncomfortable saying, look, all of this information is on the right because that's what is convenient for me to say. If I'm going to say that, if it's true, I will say it, but I feel like it really does require me to gather the evidence, sufficient evidence, to be able to say that conclusively. I really don't want to say that on a thin read of evidence because people can certainly point to, the confirmation bias and the political convenience of me doing so. So not avoiding the truth, far from it in fact, but I do want to be able to make such claims on as strong an empirical foundation as possible. And presently, I'm not able to do so. And I would like to be able to do so, which is why I'm working on research that continues the vein of the science article that we wrote that came out last year. Okay, I am done. So I can certainly, and I'm happy to invite any questions that you may have. How long did that take? 35 minutes or so, that's totally fine. So yeah, I'm happy for any questions that people have, and yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean. I think there's a few people who have questions, and let's start with Amelia Ferreira. He says, hi, Dean. Thanks for the great talk. Looking forward to chat with you later today. The question is about your quadrant. I think that you had a few slides back about sort of political trust versus ideology. Trust in the news versus ideology. And he says, is it possible that there is a disciplinary bias driving the focus on studying dis and misinformation on the right and hacktivism on the left, and ignoring the opposites? It feels like most of the literature you refer to is published in communication. I think that in social computing, computational social science, there are many studies, including of his own, Christina Lerman's, and many others outside of USC, that look pretty comprehensively at the social media landscape, including both left and right-leaning users and content, using nonpartisan lists of misinformation, etc., but still highlighted the effects are disproportionately more evident on the right. So all that, with all that being stated, are there any thoughts on the possible disciplinary bias and how to mitigate them?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely certainly possible. Not having seen the research that Amelia was referring to, I'd have to take a closer look at it. Obviously, I do refer to some of the citations I do include are from some of the broader scope of computational social science. I think that it's important to remember. I mean, one issue, one of the disadvantages, or one of the weak points is probably a strong word, but basically computational social science is really good at taking the view from 30,000 feet, right? It's really great for doing very, very large studies of lots and lots of data and drawing these overarching kind of conclusions, right? That's not controversial or anything. But most of the computational research I've seen has not really been able to answer the kinds of questions that I've advanced, right? So, again, happy to be corrected on this. If there are specific studies that address these questions, I'd love to be pointed to them. But questions about the nature of the nature of the content that may differ in terms of disinformation on the left versus right, the networks through which they spread, the hubs that are really important for spreading it, and then also questions that really can't be answered by questions that really cut to the center of what is considered disinformation versus not, right? So whether or not you consider somebody like Seth Abra to be disinformation or not, even though a lot of what was written in that article, the article didn't necessarily refer to what he did as disinformation, but a lot of what they talked about seemed to me, at least, to be very similar to what disinformation operators on the right actually do. So some of this may actually be definitional in nature, right? So I absolutely think there very well could be. I don't really like to impugn the motives of my colleagues' research, but I do think that a lot of the research that looks at the ideological differences is, similar to the work that I presented and showed in terms of the pre-Trump administration type work that says, okay, well, look at how much there is on the right, look at how much there is on the left. And that's great. I love that work. But I think that the questions I'm talking about are first of the next empirical step after that, trying to figure out what exactly is going on in terms of the spread, who's important, what are the effects that it has, and things like that. And again, I always want to stress, if there is work out that does that, please point me to it. I'm sure there's always more work to be done.
Thank you, Deen. So another question by Alex actually relates to something I would be curious about talking to you as well, I guess maybe by email. Alex Hedges says, there are two related but separate questions that he has. How exactly do you define left and right in your research? And is there any level of distinction within each ideology between moderate Democrats and progressive socialists on the left, or moderate Republicans and blatant white supremacists on the right?
That's a great question. So how to define left and right? There's actually a really long political science literature on this. And this is why I think that folks that study politics as a core part of their job are sort of really important partners to engage in this kind of research, because they can make those kinds of distinctions, right? So in terms of defining left versus right, there's a really sort of long-standing tradition of doing ideological scaling for Congress that a lot of has been borrowed in terms of extending that work onto social media. So the congressional work looks at the kinds of roll call votes that people in Congress actually take, and so that has been expanded. So in other words, if you sort of the basic way that it works is in terms of how it applies to social media is you sort of take people in Congress and you can look at who follows them, and the assumption there is that people that follow lots of folks that are on the left tend to be left-leaning. In other words, it's sort of a birds of a feather flock together assumption. People who follow lots of folks on the right tend to be more right-leaning. And so the actual algorithms are multiple. There's more than one that actually does this. The actual algorithms are more complicated than that, but that's their basic assumption that they make. Now, in terms of sort of center right versus far right, center left versus far left, that again is a really interesting question that I think research in this area should really take up. So one hypothesis there is that if you're center right or center left, you might be less vulnerable to disinformation than the extremes. So in other words, it could be not about the left versus the right, but against the extremes versus the center. That's an entirely interesting hypothesis that could be raised there. One thing I will say is that there's actually a lot of evidence that the center right has basically been hollowed out, especially during the Trump administration. That's been shown in multiple studies of social media. So there's kind of a center left and a far left and a far right, but that center right has really gotten pretty sparsely populated there. And so trying to figure out exactly how populous these segments are is another big piece of this as well.
Thank you, Deen. Actually, and as a follow-up question I personally have, so some of the work that Christina Lerman and I have done has been on understanding polarization on Twitter. And the way we define polarization, or rather the way we define, for example, people who are pro or anti-science, or people who are far left or far right, is based on URLs, and there is some precedent to this. But I was curious about your input about defining ideology based on URLs you share versus the people you follow. It sounds like from your literature they're similar, but to what degree are they the same, or are they fundamentally different?
Well, yeah, I guess I need a little more information about that method. I guess, if you're trying to define certain URLs kind of a priori as left-leaning or right-leaning, you could
To clarify, we use media bias fact check to define the political leanings of certain news sites.
Sure. Okay. So you've got pre-existing lists
Mhm.
of sites that are defined as left or right. So one question is, you look at the methodology that your source list used. I'll put that to the side for the moment. But assuming there's some validity to that, I think you could very easily use that in a similar way. So if the basic methodology is something like, okay, look at people who share lots of content from left-leaning sources versus right-leaning sources, and define them as appropriately left or right based on those proportions, I think that could work very well. And so, yeah, I think that's absolutely a fine way to go about it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then a question that Christina Lerman has, would first off, she wanted to thank you for the interesting talk and that she looks forward to chatting with you today. But what about the body of research by David Rand and Pennycook that identifies psychological or cognitive differences between partisans? How does that fit into the framework that you described?
Yeah, no, I was actually lucky enough to give a talk at Dave's research group last year. An earlier iteration of this that actually helped me change this research presentation into the one that I just gave. I think it is that area of research, as far as I understand it, is certainly an interesting one that provides a number of explanations and reasons why we might expect particular patterns of disinformation, acceptance, and sharing on the right and the left. So in some ways, you would hope that the results of computational analysis, of analysis of social media more generally, would dovetail with that. And I think that would certainly give us a reason to hypothetically expect that there would be more disinformation on the right versus the left. But even so, one of the things I point out in this presentation and my other writings on the topic is that even if there is more disproportionate amounts of disinformation on the right relative to the left, it is still interesting to study and look at whatever disinformation there is on the left to try to figure out whether it's having an impact. Because, as we saw in the case of January 6th, disinformation doesn't need to affect every single person to have an impact. So if it is having an impact on the folks on the left that are consuming it, what kind of impacts are they? Are they as strong? Are the same kinds of people being affected? And what kinds of strategies might be useful to mitigate them? Are they the same kind of strategies that have been shown to work on the right, et cetera? So these are the kinds of questions that I think that the ideological asymmetry approach raises. And these are questions that are still relevant, even if it does turn out that there are disproportionately more disinformation units, as well as people who accept that content on the right relative to the left.
Right. Thank you. And actually, as a follow-up to that, another follow-up, I guess I'm following up whenever people ask good questions, which is that when you're mentioning that there's a lot more misinformation in the right, but a lot less offline activism, it suggests some sort of contradictory things. On one hand, people on the right appear to be, at least from the literature, more susceptible to this incorrect information, but they seem to act on it less. So is there a greater threat, do you think, from a right-wing misinformation or a left? Obviously, there are examples where the right-wing misinformation has gone very, very badly, such as on January 6th. But I mean, as a general principle, do you think that there's a threat that left-wing misinformation, while less common, could drive, could also drive offline activism from people who are misinformed?
First of all, I want to correct the record. I never said that there was less offline activism on the right than there was on the left. I mean, I shouldn't know whether that's true. So that's certainly not. Don't tell people that's what Freelon said, because I didn't say that. I think one issue that we run into is that in sociology, communication, and to some extent political science, there have been definitions of social movements that have seemed to ally the very concept of social movement as being part of the left, right? So some definitions of social movement say, oh, well, they have to be going against power. And that sounds very much of a piece with left-wing politics. So I think some of this bias, some of this, focus on left-leaning content and movements, when we talk about social movements more generally, is somewhat baked into the definitions that are being used there. And so regarding the question of can there be danger with respect to left-leaning disinformation? Well, I think the challenge there is to point to specific situations where left-leaning disinformation has actually led to, I don't know, people dying or, large amounts of, destruction or other problematic actions. So anybody who wants to draw an equivalence there has to look at the consequences and the severity in terms of loss of life or other negative consequences. And at this point, I don't think it's really comparable. Now, is the potential there? Sure. But I think if you look at the actual record, what's actually happened, I don't think it's really comparable to say that the consequences are equivalent, because I think the consequences, at least as far as we've seen so far in recent history, as well as historically, at least in the United States case, I think the consequences of right-wing disinformation have been a lot more costly in terms of loss of life, people being in prison, and that sort of thing. So I think that there is a potential for negative consequences for left-leaning disinformation, but at least as far as I've seen, it hasn't been quite as nearly as severe as on the right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So as another question by Christine Lerman, in addition, other correlations, age is correlated with conservative leading, for example, could skew the media landscape by seeing the left and right divide. So I guess if I understand you, Christina, this is more or less a continuation of what she said before.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. So, the correlation of age and conservative leaning, I think raises the question of whether any disproportion that's observed in terms of disinformation between left and right is primarily an effect of age or is an effect of ideology. I think careful statistical work can look at that and try to disentangle those, and I absolutely think that future work should do this. One problem we have with social media research is that it's a lot easier to estimate ideology than it is to estimate age, especially if you have accounts that don't indicate age or don't have pictures or anything like that. So that's a really big challenge for any social media-based research that's trying to disaggregate those two variables.
Great, thank you. Question by Nathan Bartley, and he says, I'm curious to know how, in your perspective, more editorial or pop culture outlets fit into this discussion, if at all, especially on the broader left, like Daily Kos and Extended Gawkerverse.
Yeah, I think they absolutely could. I mean, I see Daily Kos as being pretty ideological. It's left-leaning and talking about politics a lot. But again, you need to do some pretty careful research. So a lot of the research in this area does work based on URL lists. So they say, okay, well, this is a disinformation, spreader. This is not. But careful research has shown that disinformation can find its way out into people's minds through mainstream sources and through sources that post some true content and some false content. So that's one of the major limitations of the URL-based approach, when you have to get below the URL level and trying to figure out what specific content is each different type of site sharing. So I absolutely think that sites that are not overwhelmingly focused or not completely focused on politics can play a role here, but that's going to require some more sophisticated methods than we've seen, especially at high scale. But I do want to point out that one of the main reasons that the URL-based approach is so popular is because those more fine-grained methods are a little bit harder to implement.
Great, thank you. And then another question from Amelia Ferreira is that I think that one of the domains where left-leaning misinformation, disinformation is most prominent is in public health, namely anti-vaccine, vaccine hesitancy, anti-science, and sometimes anti-tech, neo-Luddite sort of movements. Do you think left-leaning public health-related disinformation and misinformation can be studied under the same framework you're proposing here for political misinformation?
I absolutely do, and I think it's a really great point. Thank you for raising that. We live in an age, I don't need to tell anybody this, but we live in an age in which health is thoroughly politicized, right? So in which willingness to take the COVID-19 vaccine, willingness to wear a mask, willingness to admit the reality of COVID-19 and how harmful it is thoroughly politicized. And so we've seen that on the right. We've seen certain aspects of this on the left as well. And so I absolutely think that that's fair game to take a look at ideologically. I think other lenses we could look at this through. We've seen lots of reporting on vaccine hesitancy among African Americans. So I think race is another way to take a look at it. And then as well internationally, when you think about other sort of national leaders making conspiratorial comments about where the vaccine came from, and, Bill Gates' role and all the rest of this. I think there are lots of different ways of doing this, but at least in the United States context, I think the ideological asymmetry aspect is really helpful because it connects those kinds of tendencies with pre-existing tendencies that we already know about.
Thank you, Deen. So one final question from Emilio is, what about left-leaning conspiratorial thinking or conspiracy theories? Where does that fall into your framework? Is it political or otherwise? Is ideological discourse that can be studied under the same lens?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah, absolutely. So, great example. Actually, Seth Abra is a really good example of that, right? So, some of the conspiracy theorizing around, things like the Steele dossier, right? The idea that Russia has compromised on Trump, that he's, photographing prostitutes and the rest of this. So, I think that absolutely fits into this framework. And then you want to think about the difference between the action that was spurred by the Steele dossier, whatever it may be, and the action that was spurred by the false claim that Trump actually won the election. So that again points to the vast gulf between consequences, even though we acknowledge that there is disinformation that may exist on one side as well as on the other.
Thank you. So Ashwin asked, first off, thanks you for the talk. And he asked, what, in your opinion, is the leading to the skewness in the amount of disinformation? Could the right wing be seeking some sort of relevance that it feels it's losing among the youth and educated?
Could be. I mean, again, I think the difference, one potential source of difference here is simply difference in focus, right? So the fact that right-leaning disinformation is simply studied more, left-leaning hashtag activism is simply studied more. That's one area. Another is simply in terms of how we define it, right? So if you try to look for the equivalent of right-leaning disinformation on the left, you may not find it because it may look very different. So in other words, right, as researchers, we find what we see. So if we have to change our definitions of what disinformation actually is to recognize the core elements of what we would consider to be that, that may be necessary to be able to do. Could the right wing be seeking some sort of relevance? That's entirely possible. Certainly, as Christina mentioned in her previous question, there is a correlation between age and conservatism. I'm not sure what disinformation really gets the right among young people, except to say that there's a general connection between disinformation in terms of appealing to people's pre-existing beliefs, right? So playing into their confirmation bias. So being able to tell people what they want to hear, even if it's false, is a really good way of sort of stroking their ego and ingratiating yourself to their cause. Themselves to your cause. And so I'm not sure whether that's really driving it, but it's certainly possible.
Thank you. Are there any other questions that people have?
Yeah.
All right, then I guess perhaps there's one more question. So I was noticing that that you had mentioned, well, not in this talk, but that in your literature you have discussed IRA manipulation campaigns against Blacks, and I'm wondering if you have something they want to discuss about the effects of this IRA disinformation that's outside of just ideological bounds, that is directed towards particular races, and how that sort of relates to the left-right leaning misinformation that you've been discussing in this talk.
Yeah, well, the main purpose, and we talked about this in the paper that we wrote on this topic, the main purpose of racially targeted disinformation is to sow division along the fault lines that already exist in the society that's being targeted. So race has long been a major political and social fault line here in the United States. And so in some ways, the fact that Russia is really attacking this fault line is not a surprise. This isn't the first time they've done it. Russia has actually, in the USSR, before it broke up, used race as a major propaganda plot point in its propaganda attacks against the United States, right? So this is not any sort of special interest that they have in African Americans or African American culture. They simply use it as a means of attacking the United States, even when they're making points that are perfectly valid and true. So I think really you have to look at it in terms of information operations and information warfare, right? So in some ways, the issues that are really important to African Americans then become, fodder in this sort of propaganda war back and forth between Russia, the USSR, and the United States. And so, the way that I tend to spin that is, resolving these issues then becomes something of a national security issue, right? So when you fix these issues, when you resolve these sort of racial fissures and these problems of racism, not only do you resolve a domestic problem, but you also take away a means that a foreign adversary can use to attack us.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess with that, we're out of time, but I want to thank you again, Deen, for your great talk. And these were excellent questions that people asked. With that, I think we'll have two one-on-one discussions in the afternoon. Christina invited me to come to her meeting at 1:30, so I'll be seeing you at 1:30 as well.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I'll be back at 1:30 Pacific time to talk to you, and thank you everyone else for attending. This was nice.
Great, and just to recall that it's a different Zoom link, but yeah, I'm sure you know that. Okay.
Yeah, I've got that.
Great. All right, I'll see everyone later. Bye.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye now.